That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, my dudes, this has been one of our most requested videos in a very long time. But literally every single premiere, we've been saying, Mason, who are your favorite stacking candidates? Who are your favorite stacking candidates? So I really want to make a video completely devoted to the draft strategy in going through and drafting two teammates from the same team. I want to talk about where it's optimal to do so, where I think you should actually avoid doing so. And then at the end of the video, I'll dive into my favorite stacks in drafts right now, considering where you're going to have to draft them. But of course, guys, before we get into it, please go down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. And y'all know you can find pretty much everything that you would ever want over there on Patreon. Our rankings, our tiers, our draft guide. I mean, I would even go through and make a podcast breaking down your individual team. We have extra podcasts there every single day. So please consider joining the flock there as well. And yeah, let's dive into this video. And with stacking, I know we have gotten so much pushback, especially in live streams, where I've gone through and I've tried to give a short explanation on why it's so beneficial and why it definitely optimizes your roster when you go through and you draft a quarterback and his top wide receiver from that same team on your same fantasy team. And I know a lot of people have told me, well, Mason, that makes no sense. Mason, I hate stacking. Literally, I'll never do it. And please hear me out on this. Please watch the entire video because I think I will be able to change your mind here. And let me just dive into the theory of stacking and why I believe that is optimal in fantasy football. And a big thing that we talked about all the time that I really never hear anybody else talking about, but it's the reality of the game. And we have to understand the game that we are playing in trying to actually win. We are playing in fantasy football leagues. And in the majority of fantasy football leagues, you're going to have 11 other opponents. And if you do some quick math, you divide 1 by 12, you'll see that on average, you have an 8.3% chance to win your fantasy league. So what that tells us is over 9 out of 10 times you are going to lose your league. So instead of being worried about losing your league, understanding that that's the most likely outcome anyway, what we have to do is we have to take that 1 out of 12 chance that you have, and you have to try to do everything that you can to make that 8% a little bit higher. Because if you're a fantasy football player and you can win 20% of your leagues on a year-to-year basis, you are highly profitable. I mean, you are a great fantasy player. And that's why we are investing so much of our money this year, pretty much every penny that I have, into fantasy leagues. We're going to be kicking off a ton of $500 leagues over there on Patreon because I believe that we can get our win rate up there to 15 to 18%. Last year, it was over 25%, but that was not sustainable. There's no way we're going to be able to do that again. But regardless, everything you are trying to do is push that win rate up, and you don't have to worry about losing your league. So we're raising our ceiling, not worrying at all about our floor, because finishing 6th and finishing 12th in your league is the exact same thing. You did not earn any money. You did not win the league. What's the point there? Maybe you saved yourself from a little bit of embarrassment. And if you're playing in a league where the last place team maybe has to do some kind of punishment, then maybe this strategy isn't for you, because it is definitely going to go through and it's going to raise your ceiling, but it's going to lower your floor. Because we know when you draft someone in the 3rd round of your fantasy draft, you're essentially going through and you're going, you know what? I'm going to bet $10 here that Stefon Diggs is going to return value on his ADP, that he's going to beat this ADP. And if that happens, it's going to raise my chances of winning the league. Well, let's say that that actually happened. Let's say that your chances of winning the league did go through and increase. Why are you not going to try to make that just amplify? Why are you not going to try to exaggerate the difference in your win rate once you hit on that Stefon Diggs bet? And how you do that is by drafting his quarterback. Because we know if Stefon Diggs just goes out there and completely smashes his ADP, there's a decent chance that Josh Allen did the same thing. And you can pick this with literally any quarterback wide receiver combination through the entire NFL. And of course, it's not going to happen every single time. I mean, you can't necessarily just draft Dak Prescott and expect, if Dak Prescott turns out to be a top 3 quarterback in fantasy, all of a sudden, all of CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, and Michael Gallup all completely smash their ADP. I mean, that's not necessarily what's guaranteed here. But we know that if you look at correlation and you just understand how math works, it's going to definitely raise the probability of your bet. So what you're doing is you're essentially making a parlay. You're making a 16 parlay if y'all are normal to sports betting. I'm sure everybody knows this. But when you make that parlay, you're making uncorrelated bets. You're just going, I'm making a bet here, and if this hits, it has no impact on what happens over here. Well, here you're actually making a parlay and you're going, okay, well, if this hits, then this is more likely to hit as well. So that's really why you're trying to go through and make those stacks. And we actually have real world examples of stacks winning fantasy football leagues last year. If you go through, there were 4 stacks that I really want to identify and that are perfect examples for what happened. And the first one we already discussed, Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen. So Josh Allen was being drafted as the quarterback 10 last year in drafts. Stephon Diggs was being drafted as the wide receiver 21. So Josh Allen came out and he completely smashed. Josh Allen finishes as the quarterback 1 in fantasy. So if you drafted Josh Allen as the quarterback 10, you probably had a decent shot to win your league. Well, at the same time, Stephon Diggs, who was being drafted as the wide receiver 21, came out and he finishes as the wide receiver 3 in fantasy. So if you drafted both players, knowing that, hell, if Josh Allen hits, most likely Stephon Diggs is as well, and you get that league-breaking upside from the combination of the two, all of a sudden, that's how you win your league. You see the same thing with Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams, where Aaron Rodgers was being drafted as the quarterback 7 last year. He finishes as the quarterback 3 in fantasy points per game. And Davante Adams was a 2nd round draft pick last year, and he comes through and finishes as the wide receiver 1. That's a worse example because the prices are a little bit more expensive. Now, there's plenty more where that came from. Deshaun Watson, Will Fuller. Deshaun Watson was being drafted as the quarterback 6. He finishes as the quarterback 5. Will Fuller was being drafted as the wide receiver 32. He finishes as the wide receiver 8. And keep in mind, guys, all these stats are on a per game basis. If anybody's telling you season long numbers, if you're watching a video and they try telling you, oh, so-and-so had 80 broken tackles this season, he's better than so-and-so who had 70 broken tackles, and they don't fill in the information that, well, this running back played 16 games, this running back played 7 games, that literally is garbage. It doesn't mean anything. You want to be looking at everything through a per game lens. And now our last stack is going to be Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen. Now, Justin Herbert, you probably got him off the waiver wire. He was going undrafted in the majority of fantasy drafts last year. He finishes as the quarterback 8, and Keenan Allen was being drafted as the wide receiver 15, and he finishes as the wide receiver 6. So there are so many different examples of this working, and I think implementing it going forward, there are going to be some simple rules that we need to acknowledge. So like we already said, when you're stacking, you're essentially making bets and you're going, okay, if bet 1 hits, bet 2 is most likely going to. So if my quarterback performs well, his wide receivers are as well. But it's a little bit different when it comes to the profile of quarterbacks that you are targeting. And the main thing that I want to focus in on is pocket passing quarterbacks versus rushing quarterbacks. Because we know when you draft a pocket passing quarterback, you are only betting on passing yards. You're only betting on passing touchdowns for them to come through and for them to beat their ADP in fantasy. Because if you drafted Tom Brady, it's not like you're necessarily expecting him to pick up 4 rushing touchdowns, have 20 rushing yards a game, and that's how he's going to beat his ADP in fantasy. No, if you drafted Tom Brady, you go, okay, I'm drafting him because I think he can lead the NFL in passing yards. I think he can lead the NFL in passing touchdowns, which would directly make an impact on his wide receivers. And those are the type of quarterbacks that you're wanting to stack. Whereas on the other hand, with rushing type quarterbacks, they are a lot less important to actually go out there and draft their wide receivers. Because you can believe that Jalen Hurts, you can believe that Lamar Jackson, that Trey Lance, any of those elite rushing quarterbacks can come through and provide elite fantasy numbers. And at the same time, those guys don't have to do it with passing volume. And if they aren't doing it with passing volume, we don't necessarily know if their wide receivers are going to hit. Well, yes, there's going to be a slight correlation there. If Lamar Jackson beats his ADP, you can probably bet that Lamar Jackson is going to provide more value to Mark Andrews, to Rashad Bateman, and really every player in that offense. But at the same time, it's not going to be as strong as a correlation of what we did with that Tom Brady example with what would happen to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. So those are the two main differences there, where if you have a rushing quarterback, I'm fine stacking him with one of his options. If you drafted Jalen Hurts, I'm fine with you deciding to draft Dallas Goedert. If you draft Lamar Jackson, I'm fine with you deciding to draft Mark Andrews. If you decide to draft Trey Lance, I'm fine with you taking Brandon Ayuk. But really, beyond that, we've gotten some questions of people saying, well, Mason, if I have Trey Lance, is it overkill if I have George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk? And I'll say yes to that. I would be very surprised if you have those rushing quarterbacks that you're kind of making a bet that they're going to average 40, 50 rushing yards a game. I mean, I would be surprised if they were actually going to have the passing volume at the same time. If they would, I mean, all of a sudden they're the best fantasy assets of all time. But I think that's probably an outlier bet that we're going to be avoiding. So now when it comes down to my favorite targets this year, I think if we go back and look at the examples of the league winning stacks that we found, what you really want to be avoiding is you want to be avoiding the premium stacks. I think going out there and chasing the guys going at the very top of drafts just to fit a stack, I don't necessarily know how much upside you actually have in that scenario. I mean, we look at the Kansas City Chiefs. Well, of course, everybody can come out here and they can say, oh, Kansas City, my favorite stack. If I can get anybody, I'm getting Kansas City. Well, yeah, of course, everybody has that point. But at the same time, you have to understand that cost is really going to be prohibiting that. And you're really going to be putting all your eggs in that one basket to the point where, I mean, what is the upside even if they do come through? Because Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, all being drafted as the number one player at their respective positions. So in the case of the Kansas City Chiefs, not too interested. The same thing that you can see in Buffalo with Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. The same thing you can see in Arizona with Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins. Well, yes, I mean, if they fall to be good values, I am perfectly fine doing so, but I don't necessarily want to call them our favorite stacks in fantasy. Now, I have a list of favorite stacks that we can target that's going to be actually a lot cheaper than the ones we previously mentioned. And the first one is going to be the Seattle Seahawks. And the Seahawks are a perfect example of me bringing up a team and going, know what you're doing when you're betting on the Seahawks. So if you draft DK Metcalf in the third round, right now he's going as the wide receiver 6, know that you are kind of betting that the Seattle Seahawks with Shane Waldron as their offensive coordinator, they're not going to be running the ball very often. They are going to be a little bit more pass happy because that's how DK Metcalf can beat his ADP as the wide receiver 6. And then if you decided to take DK Metcalf there and you're going, okay, we're betting on the passing offense, might as well come away with having Russell Wilson as the quarterback 7 and Tyler Lockett as a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3, if you can get them as those respective prices. Now, I'm fine with Chris Carson in fantasy drafts this year, and this is the first year that I'm actually able to say that. But I think drafting a running back in this scenario would be very, very poor, where if you're kind of getting DK Metcalf, the last thing I want to do is also be drafting Chris Carson. Because the problem there is you're hedging your bets. You're going, okay, well, yes, I mean, if this team goes pass happy, we are going to beat ADP with DK Metcalf. That bet is going to be very good. Whereas maybe you're not going to have that same type of upside with a Chris Carson. Where on the other hand, if this team decides to go run heavy, well, yeah, I mean, great pick with Chris Carson, but all of a sudden that DK Metcalf selection that you had in the third round probably didn't pan out. So while that will most likely raise your floor, I think that actually lowers your ceiling, where I'm not looking to draft Chris Carson and these wide receivers on the same team. I'm fine with drafting them on two separate teams, but in the same roster, I think that's going to be a really bad build, and I think it's going to do everything opposite of what we are trying to accomplish. And now our next team is going to be a little more expensive in terms of their second option. It's going to be the Tennessee Titans with Ryan Tannehill, AJ Brown, and Julio Jones. So obviously this is going to be a stack that you're getting the wide receivers way before you're getting the quarterback. I mean, right now, Ryan Tannehill is being drafted as the quarterback 12 in fantasy. So you're taking AJ Brown as the wide receiver 8. You're taking Julio Jones as a mid wide receiver 2. And what's going to be a little bit more difficult about this stack is later on in the draft, once you already commit to drafting both AJ Brown and Julio Jones, I don't necessarily think you need to draft both, but I'm fine doing so, understanding that Tannehill is someone that can come through with elite passing efficiency. And if you draft him, it's not like he is a Lamar Jackson. You're betting on the passing volume being there. But if you decide to take both AJ Brown and Julio Jones, at that point, you really lock yourself in to Ryan Tannehill. I mean, there would literally be no draft that I would draft both Julio and Julio Jones. Both AJ Brown and Julio Jones and not come away with Ryan Tannehill. I mean, even if you saw Kyler Murray fall to the 6th, 7th round of your fantasy draft, you're kind of going to have to sit on your hands. You're kind of going to have to decide to wait until maybe Ryan Tannehill is around above ADP, and that's where you have to actually draft him. Because once you take wide receivers like that so early at a high draft price, you lock yourself in. Because, I mean, if you draft both AJ Brown and Julio Jones and they both hit in fantasy, Ryan Tannehill is as well. So you need to have him on that same roster if you really want to maximize your upside. So now this is by far and away, and I mean, it isn't even close right here, my favorite stack of 2021. It's going to be the Jacksonville Jaguars. Y'all know I talk about these wide receivers all the time. Trevor Lawrence currently being drafted as the quarterback 14, Laviska Shenault being drafted as a low-end wide receiver 3, and you actually have DJ Chark right there with them. I mean, you're getting both of these guys as low-end wide receiver 3s. Sometimes they're falling down to the wide receiver 4 range, which is fantastic. I mean, you can really go through and bolster the very top of your roster with running backs in this draft scenario where you're going, okay, let's spend the first 2 rounds on running back. Let's get an elite tight end at the same time. And this team is going to be fantastic if the Jacksonville Jaguars do hit. If Trevor Lawrence comes out, lives up to expectations, maybe surpasses him, say he is Justin Herbert from last year. And then we definitely know that both DJ Chark and Laviska Shenault, or maybe only one of them, because if one of them kind of fades out and maybe doesn't beat their ADP, with how late they are being drafted, it's completely fine. It isn't the same scenario of you drafting a player like a DK Metcalf and a player like a Cooper Kupp. I mean, they're so cheap that you're going to have a juggernaut roster built around them. And if the Jacksonville Jaguars hit, I think that is just all upside. So now our next team is going to be the Los Angeles Rams with Matthew Stafford. I mean, this is the perfect example of going through and getting a double stack on this team. If you're drafting Stafford, I definitely want to be coming away with both Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods if you can. And I think you can actually do this in a lot of different formats. I think if Robert Woods falls to the 5th for you, say you're picking at the 5-6 turn, and you can get Woods Kupp there, I mean, that is a no-brainer. And with Matthew Stafford, obviously, he's a quarterback that you're not betting in on the rushing production. Instead, you're betting on the passing volume. And he's going as the quarterback 11 right now. So I definitely like the Rams. I mean, the Bucs are a very similar team where they have clearly 2 top-end wide receiver options, but they're both expensive compared to Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, and Tom Brady more expensive than Matthew Stafford. So I think we do prefer the Rams at a slight discount. Now our last team is going to be Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals. Here with Joe Burrow, I mean, you're getting him as the quarterback 13. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, both low-end wide receiver 2s. And I would not be that surprised if Joe Burrow ended up leading the NFL in passing yards this upcoming season. I think that's definitely in the range of outcomes. So given the fact that he has the passing volume attainable, I think that going through and betting with the Cincinnati Bengals is probably a pretty good bet. Now, thank you, my dudes. Please let me know what y'all think about this. I really want to be making sure we're focusing in on stacking the offenses that have the passing volume. And what's great about stacking is you don't go into the draft and go, okay, I am 100% getting the Seattle Seahawks draft. No, that is not what you do. What you do is you go in, you just let the first few rounds fall to you. And then once maybe you find a good value on a Robert Woods, on a T. Higgins, on a DK Metcalf, on really anybody, that's when you commit to the stack. That's when you go, okay, well, we drafted DK Metcalf in the 3rd. We drafted Robert Woods in the 5th. We drafted T. Higgins in the 6th. Now that we're in the 8th, 9th round, we have a couple different options on where we can go with our quarterback. And let's try to map it out from there. So please don't go into drafts going, okay, I need this stack 100% of the time. Go in with a flexible mindset going, these are my options where the value falls, and this is how we can construct our roster from here. But yeah, that's all I got for you, my dudes. Of course, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. I really hope y'all enjoy this video, and I'll see y'all with the premiere tomorrow. We've gotten a ton of new members joining the flock. Thank you, Grind for Gold, Devin, Bungified, Brian, Brody, Victor, Chris, Grant, Trevor, and David. Thank you, my dudes.